and we'll get started. I'm just gonna do one last little mute, and I'll kind of mute to make sure there's no background noise. Just when we have so many people, it's just helpful to do that. All right, let's get started. Hello, Ron. Hello, Neil. It's really, really nice to have you guys here. So my name is Erica, and I run the communications and some community programming here at the OWA. And for those that haven't joined this session yet, it's become a really nice community. We do this once a month, and it's a nice chance for us to chat with the folks that have generously created a video for us all about things that they're doing on their property. And it's a nice way for us to also meet, virtually in this day and age. It's kind of hard for us to get and tour each other's properties. So this is a nice chance for us to meet in lieu of that. We've had so much positive feedback, and clearly so many people are making use of this. We have over 600 or 700 views on these videos, so it's gotten a lot of use. So tonight I'm joined by Ron and by Neil. Both are members of the OWA and also involved in the Canadian Chestnut Council. So what I like to do is just start off very casually, just have Ron and Neil remind us of who they are and where they're coming from today, and a little bit about how they got to where they are, maybe how they got interested in chestnuts. And then from there, we have the rest of the time for question and answer. So don't be shy. Please bring your questions. Please bring your curiosity and just ask away. If you'd like, you can also write your questions in the chat, and I'll ask them for you. But other than that, just speak up and ask what you'd like. And I'll be circulating this recording later. So again, don't feel like you have to, fervishly write things down. So on that, Ron, why don't you go first and just introduce yourself a little bit for us?
Okay, my name's Ron Casier, and I'm the current chair of the Canadian Chestnut Council. And I got involved with the American Chestnut back in 2008. I'm a retired high school teacher. I do have a small farm, and I went to my first council meeting and promptly got elected a director, and haven't looked back since. I've always had an interest in nuts. I had a bit of a nut orchard on the property with no Native American chestnuts. So I've always had an interest in forestry and that. I'm a member of the Elgin-Middlesex Chapter, and I sit on the executive for our local chapter. And so I take a big interest in forestry. I'm also part of the Elgin Stewardship Council. So forestry is part of our mandate as well. And yeah, I guess that's about it.
Awesome.
I'll turn it over to Neil.
Hi, Neil.
Hello. Yeah, so I'm a member of the Brant County Woodlotter, the Brant Woodlot Owners Association. And we're actually in Haldeman and Hamilton as well. My wife and I bought our woodlot in the early 2000s, and I was out inventorying the 17 acres and found a leaf like this in the woods.
Very cool.
And it kind of looked like a beech leaf, but I knew it was something different. And when I looked into my trees in Canada book, I found that it was American chestnut, which I barely heard of before that time. Just it's one tree, and eventually I got in touch with the Canadian Chestnut Council. I went to a few of their AGMs up at the Tim Horton Onondaga camp. And then I met Ron actually a few years ago at the Brant Rod and Gun Club Eco Conference. Ron, I forget if you were there to speak or as a
Yeah, I think I was.
So Ron came by and saw the tree with me on his way back to Elgin, and I got it registered after that, and was more recently asked to become a board member of the Canadian Chestnut Council. So I'm now on the board and doing their Instagram and Facebook.
As you do, right? Once you show an interest in something, oh, you're on the board. You're not going away. We need you.
One other thing I'll mention is that we decided that our tree, which is about 40 feet tall, could become part of the breaking isolation project. And maybe I think that'll come up later. So I'll let Ron, do you want to talk about the orchard now, Ron, a bit?
Oh, my research orchards. So it was planted in 2011, and we added to it over the next 5 years as nursery stock became available. And so now we have trees that are 30, 35 feet tall. And we've been inoculating now for 6 years. And by inoculation, we're testing these second generation trees to see how resistant they are to the blights. And as I mentioned in the video, we use 2 different types of virulence, a low virulent and a high virulent, just to see how the tree responds. It responds to the low virulent. One of the things we run into is our growing season is much shorter than what you'd find farther south, and therefore our trees have a very short window to respond to the attack of the blight. Because of course the blight has a longer growing season because it doesn't necessarily is impacted with low light or low temperatures compared to the actual tree. So that's one of our challenges in looking at the testing. And then from our best F2s that show resistance, we'll cross them, and that produces our F3, our third generations, which we've now produced for 3 years. And we have roughly 600 trees planted out at Onondaga at a special isolated site.
Wonderful. So I think we've had a great question if we could have a longer look at the leaf. So I'm going to show that now, and maybe Ron, you could give a little bit of an overview of what we're looking at.
Okay, well, the key thing is that long lancelet leaf, and it does look like a beech leaf, except beech leaves are shorter and broader. But that lance shape is very key. Chinese and the other will have slightly different shape, broader at the base, broader at the top. The big thing with American chestnut is that hook at the end, because that's what Danata is referring to, is that hook. Now this leaf is fairly dried out, so the hooks are kind of straight, but generally you would find a very sharp little curl on the end there. There's a few on the upper left-hand corner that are showing the traditional. Color-wise, a nice forest green and a matte finish. Other chestnuts, of course, like the Chinese, has a really glossy finish to it, and it's a much darker green, and it's a very heavy, coarse leaf with lots of hairs on the back. The American chestnut has less hair on the back. Now, of course, in hybrids, that's when the characteristics combine, and that becomes a little more difficult to distinguish. But
Okay,
that kind of gives you an idea.
So this one on the screen here, Neil sent this to me. What is this that we're looking at? What kind is this one?
That's a burr that has 3 developed chestnuts. So normally a burr would contain the 3 like that, and very typically American chestnut, that the nut is actually small compared to what you would see in a Chinese or a European, which are a much bigger nut. American chestnut evolved as a wildlife mass. So passenger pigeon used to swallow this whole.
Wow.
Turkeys will swallow whole, although they often pick out the best parts and leave the rest, what I'm finding in my woodlot. But that's probably a learned thing.
And
But it
so-
had to be small enough for a bird to swallow into its crop. And of course, was a dependable food for most wildlife.
And so this leaf here, is this a typical American chestnut leaf, or is this what you would consider glossy?
No, this would be, I'm trying to look here. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily think that this is an American. They're
Okay.
pretty straight. I'm only seeing a couple slight curls. And again, it depends on the maturation of the leaf as well. Sometimes you look at an American and you start at the bottom and you're thinking like, oh, this leaf isn't quite right. And then you about eye level, then the leaves are a little more mature.
Okay. Does anyone here have what they might think is a chestnut and not sure what to do about it? Like,
Okay, Rand,
Yeah,
you can turn it on when you're ready there
okay, do you want to finish it up? then?
for 4 minutes, yeah.
hi, Carol Ann
Yeah.
Simpson.
Hello there.
Hello, do you have a question?
No, I don't. I'm sorry. I should have been muted.
Okay. Okay, so does anybody have any questions relating to identification? Maybe you think you have one or not, and you're not sure how to go about it. Like how to go about accessing more professional advice. Just wait.
My name is Terry. I guess I do have a question on that.
Yep.
So I have a chestnut tree in the Dundas area. And I would say it's probably about 30 feet tall. And my father actually planted it. I'm not sure where it came from though, but he always said it was an American chestnut he planted. And it's doing very well. We protect it a lot. It's in a kind of it's in a front lot, it's on a bit of a farm in the front yard, but it's surrounded by other trees, so it gets lots of shade. But I don't really know if it's F1, F2, or for sure what it is. So how would do you take is there something you could take a leaf sample and send it somewhere, or how do you want to look at it? Or is anybody interested in seeing it?
Sure, we'd be very interested. What we can do, we don't know the pedigree. We do have a program that's, I believe, still running, where if you get us a fresh leaf sample, so we'll have to wait till the spring now, and we can have a DNA analysis done on it, and it will tell us the amount of American and probably give us a good indication if it's got other chestnuts in its background. So if it's Chinese or European in the background. But yes, the council would be very much interested in seeing the tree, and just get a hold of me through our website. Actually, you can get a hold of Heather. And of course, can't think of Heather's last name right now. Neil?
Ron, when I send out the email with the recording, I'll send that to everybody. So I'll make
One of
sure I
our
send.
Heather
Over.
is our director who's taking care of the DNA analysis.
Yeah.
So-
Heather Dover. Heather
Okay.
Dover.
Heather
Dover, sorry.
Yeah.
My apologies to Heather. My brain goes blank sometimes. But her contact information is in our website in the director's list. And that's open to anyone that's got a tree. Just make sure it's in a chestnut, not a horse chestnut. We often get horse chestnuts being sent. And it's not even a close relative of the edible chestnuts. Horse chestnuts are quite toxic. We actually had an incident last year where a woman was informed that she had a horse chestnut and not to eat it, and she went and cooked them up anyways and nearly poisoned herself. So it's one of those dangers.
Great. Well, that's helpful. My father's passed away, but I'm very, very sorry. He was a tree guy and knew his trees very well, and he was always very proud of the fact that this was a American chestnut. He got it as a small tree. He planted it. So I'm pretty sure it is, but it's worth checking. But I'd just be curious. And the other thing is, I always look at it every year. It's very healthy. It's doing fine. Where would I look if it starts getting blight or sickness that shows up in the bark? Is it right?
Yeah, it'll show up more if there's a wound in the tree or in the crotch of a branch. If you start getting little orangish colored, I would call them blisters or bumps, that could be an indication of blight coming in. Once it's into the cambium, the bark will collapse. You'll get a depression, and it will turn the bark a rusty orange. And of course, when the fruiting bodies come out, then you will definitely get a stronger orange coloration. But generally, the bark will sink because the cambium is being choked off, as is the phloem, and that it collapses in and eventually kills the spring wood under the bark as well. So the blight stuffs the xylem and phloem cells full of oxalic acid. And that's what actually kills the tree, because it prevents communication from the roots to the leaves and the leaves back to the root. Now, fortunately, chestnut has the ability that the blight will not spread below ground level. So the roots and the root collar remain alive. And so the main trunk can die, and then the root collar will send out several new trunks and try to regrow the tree. And so you see this a lot of times on older trees. You'll see multiple trunks. There's one here in Elgin, the Light Cemetery tree has two large trunks who are full of blight, but they keep growing. So it's one of the trees that we're very interested in. And it's also one of the rare trees that is self-pollinating. So it's a very rare occurrence. Generally, chestnut needs two. So if your chestnut needs a partner, we can see if we can arrange to get it a part or two, so that when it does start flowering, that it can cross-pollinate, and you can get the production of nuts. Especially if it isn't a pure American, that would be a great opportunity to include it into the program.
And who pays for that, Ron? Is there funding from the Chestnut Council to pay for that genetic testing, or would the landowner pay for that? And what's the kind of cost?
I believe we're asking for a donation of, I think it's $25, which basically just covers our cost for having the test done at the University of Guelph. So we have arrangements there to have that done. And so, but again, anyone that's interested should check with Heather. Heather would have the most recent information and when the test, and also give instructions on how the leaf should be collected. But it's got to be done on a fresh leaf. A leaf from last year is too desiccated now.
Awesome. I have a question from Trisha. What is the name of your Facebook page on chestnuts, Neil?
It's the Canadian Chestnut Council.
Okay. A question from Mary Simpson. There's a growing interest in establishing silvopasture by growing rows of various trees and shrubs to provide shade, forage to cattle, sheep, goats, chickens, etc. Could you talk about the value of American chestnuts to silvopasture alleys? Is there a species we should consider? What are the pros and cons of planting American chestnut in this context?
So I assume this is like a permaculture.
It's more like agroforestry. So you're basically
Agroforestry, yeah.
taking a big field and planting it with chestnuts and having the sheep and such roam through it.
I do have a neighbor who has got about 100 American chestnuts from the council, and he's growing it for he refers to as permaculture, but he's also pasturing goats and cattle and some other livestock, I believe. Biggest thing with the American chestnut would be, because it's a wild tree, deer love it. And so our biggest challenge for us, even in our research plots, is getting the tree over 6 feet tall without the deer browsing the lead off. So the biggest problem would be, once the tree is over 6 feet, that would prevent deer browse. Having raised goats will definitely peel the bark off of anything unless it's mature bark. So you'd have to let your chestnuts grow for probably about 15 to 20 years before you dare let goats in. Cattle would rub. But again, this would be with any tree, not necessarily chestnut. So you'd have to have some sort of guard around the tree. In some circumstances, if we have heavy deer browse, we've actually caged the individual trees in, we use corn crib wire, make these 2 foot in diameter loops and about 6 feet tall, and then drive in 2 stakes on either side and chicken strap them into the ground. And that will keep most deer out. But if you get a big buck, the buck will get his horns tangled in the cage, and he will take the cage and both posts and everything and disappear with it, along with the tree, of course. He has to eat that first. But that'd be some of the challenges. So it would be protecting chestnuts. In 50 years, you can grow a log-sized tree. I know a number of local guys here whose dads grew chestnut back in the 40s and 50s, and managed to get market-sized trees that actually are cut up for timber. So it's a fast-growing tree. You'll get the nuts produced. Historically, farmers used to let their hogs run through the chestnut orchards, and the chestnut gave the pork a specific taste that used to get a premium in the market. And there's historical records in Chicago being 50 cents a pound more for chestnut fed hogs. And so that was another use. So I guess that would tie in a little bit into practicing silviculture. It would take a while to get the trees large enough that the livestock wouldn't necessarily damage the trees, but I think that would be true of any tree. The only drawback is the burrs. The ground gets covered in those burrs. A lot of times urban foresters want to plant American chestnuts as boulevard trees, and we're like, not a good idea, because those burrs and lawnmowers and the other things are the burrs get swept into the gutters, and of course they would collect on the drainage grates and plug them up fairly well. And I can imagine a guy reaching in trying to get flood water to disappear and getting spiked on all these burrs. The name is very appropriate. Even when they're green, they do keep the squirrels out. So that tells you how well armed they are. I don't know if I really answered all that idea of the question.
Mary, did that cover it? Do you have any?
Yes, excellent. And obviously if the deer love it, then probably the cows and the goats, it probably has good nutritional value as well.
I raised goats for 20 years, and every time they escaped, every tree in my farmyard was destroyed except for things that were 30 or years older or older. I had to replant all the time. So you definitely have to have some sort of guard around the tree and anchored well enough that cattle couldn't push it over. You could probably get away with T-bars and that, but then as the tree grew up, you'd have to remove all of that because eventually they do get anchored in the roots and you won't get your T-bar back.
Today we have
But-
like Gallagher fencing with solar powered. So maybe, we'll just have to invest in the fencing to collect the wool.
He's got his trees in rows. He's interplanting with raspberry and some other haspet berry and all that. And I know he's using electrical wire to keep his goats in line. But I know goats, they're devious little devils. And if your power goes off for 30 seconds, they're off. They're through the fence. But I think it's doable. One of the things you could look at too is chestnut is probably a good carbon sink. We were contacted recently by a company in the States that's promoting as an investment chestnut farms as carbon sinks, as an investment thing. Now theirs is all based on Chinese chestnut, but their research showed that a Chinese tree will put around 8 tons of carbon away in the earth and in its mass in about 10 years. Now, Chinese chestnut grows to about 40 feet, and it's a low shrubby tree. The American chestnut, if you let it grow, it will grow to 115 feet, and you'll get a trunk at the base that's almost 3 meters across. So the amount of carbon you can put away, now that's going to take maybe 200 years to grow, but it would be a huge carbon sink because that's the trunk and the tree above the ground. There's probably an equal amount below the ground in the root structure as well. So there's an area that needs to be investigated more.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the question, Mary. We have another question from Rose. Where's the natural northern boundary for American chestnut in Ontario?
Well, historically, it would run from Grand Bend across towards Oshawa. It dips somewhat in Oxford, but that's roughly the line. Very similar to the Carolinian zone. But we now know that we have mature, viable American chestnuts at Sault Ste. Marie that are producing nuts on a yearly basis. And there's also some trees in North Bay.
Wow.
So climate is that historical boundary is basically its migration northward. And of course, that was interrupted by the colonial period. But the tree was probably moving northward. But basically, it's found along the north shore of Lake Erie and in the entire Niagara Peninsula, and then curled up into about Oshawa. But we now have trees growing on up at Dyer's Bay. I know there's been plantings in Ottawa. And also 30 years ago, the council sent materials out to the maritime provinces. So there are trees in Prince Edward, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and in the Avon Peninsula in Newfoundland. And so we have contact with some of our members out there, and they keep track of all these planted trees. And they were sent out there as an idea that we sent them out beyond the natural range, they'd be safe from the blight. But about 6 years ago, somehow accidentally, blight was introduced to the trees in Halifax. And so the city of Halifax, to prevent the spread of blight, cut down all the trees in the infected park and had the wood destroyed. And so there hasn't been any other outbreaks, but it was a loss of some major park trees there that were starting to, 30 years old. The trees are, 40, 45 feet tall. So like they're becoming impressive trees. So that was a loss, but it just shows that blight spreads very easily. And so we try to take precautions on not coming in contact with blighted trees and then going into an area. So we try to sanitize between different areas so that we don't accidentally introduce blight from one area to another.
This is a good segue to the next question. Eleanor's question is, how far do the blight spores travel? Would it be helpful to plant chestnuts north of their northern range?
Well, we definitely want people. We're hoping we've started to do some projects where we're outside the native range, because with climate change and that, the tree can migrate north. And we're working on the idea that once we have our blight resistant tree, it would be important to reintroduce it into the natural landscape to help restore our wildlife populations. The decline of the chestnut also meant the decline of about 250 to 275 species of animals, birds, insects. There's at least 11 insects that have known to become extinct, although one was just found in an isolated area in Pennsylvania about 5 years ago, the chestnut sawfly. It's just found in one small little area, so it's had a refuge. But it's a very good mass tree in that it produces nuts every year, so wildlife can depend upon it. All the other nut trees go on a 2 to 3 to 4 year cycle, so they're not dependable for that annual supply of mast in the fall. And so, and as I mentioned in the video, the wild turkeys clean my research plot every evening. And sometimes they're in the day. If I'm working in the yard or on the farm somewhere, I can often hear the turkey moving around and calling inside the woodlot. And they know they're perfectly safe since I'm not a hunter and I don't allow hunting on my property, but does attract a large flock into my neighborhood that does allow hunting. So it's a bit of a refuge here. But that idea of spreading it beyond the Carolinian zone, I think it was meant to spread farther than the Carolinian zone. So we're hoping to get it back on the landscape, back into its ecological role for sure. But then there's also the economic benefit. The nuts would be sellable, the timber would be sellable. And of course, prior to the blight coming into Canada in about 1924, it spread across southern Ontario. Chestnut was an important wood and also important food supply. And if you look at the states, for the Appalachian states, chestnut was the economic driver. And the decline of the chestnut also was part of the decline of the Appalachian states in their economy, because chestnut was an export. There's also the pharmaceuticals. There's a number of pharmaceuticals that can be extracted from chestnut. One of them is tannin. And so we've done some work with the University of Toronto and the University of Calgary, looking at tannin extraction, the idea of going back to a traditional tanning process for leather, rather than using the petrochemical methods that we use now. So there's interest in that aspect as well. So that's part of the economy, and the culture is, a year ago, the Toronto Star did a thing about chestnuts roasting on an open fire. And I don't know if you may have seen that podcast. But that cultural thing of roasting chestnuts, and having eaten all the different types of chestnut, American chestnut by far may be small and a lot of work to clean and open up, but by far the taste is much superior than anything you can import, Chinese or European, I found. And they're fresh grown. So, and I know locally, some of the chestnut growers here, now they're using F2 trees across the Chinese with American, but they usually sell out well before Christmas, their entire year's harvest.
Wow.
So there is a growing demand for chestnut. So it has its economic, but we've got to get our blight-free tree or resistant tree in place to make it a realistic.
Eleanor, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, Louis.
So the next question from Becky is, how long will the blight
Your
take
favorite?
to kill the tree from time of infection to death?
Oh, Jane Karsh. Oh, yeah, right. Okay, hang on just a minute here.
The,
I have to dig it up.
Sorry, I'm just trying
Depends on-
to, there we go. I'll mute. There we go. Carry on.
It depends on the strength of the strain of blight that's infecting it. In North America here, it's estimated that we have about 200 plus strains of blight. And there's some research that's been done that indicates that there was a Native American blight, but it was very weak. But that when the blight was introduced from Asia, they crossed and they made a much more virulent, there's a hybrid virulence that was created. And that's why the trees died here very quickly. Historically, the blight came in about 1924 at the Niagara Peninsula. And by the end of 1925, the infection had spread all the way to Windsor and into Michigan, because there's an extension of the Ontario trees into lower Michigan there as well. So it spread very quickly. Out of that, 1.5 to 2 million trees were estimated to be in Ontario at the time. And today we have a little over 2,000 survivors. So it kills the tree fairly quickly. Again, age is important. Young trees, it will kill in one season. In fact, we've had trees that we've planted out that seem fine. Mid-season, we'll see some blight at the base of the stem, and by the fall, they're dead. And generally, if those are planted in our orchards or in one of our outplantings, we would destroy the tree anyways, because we don't want the blight getting a foothold in the area. An older tree would probably take 2 to 3 years. But again, it all depends on the tree. Back in our survey of 2004, there was one tree that was noted that bad shape on its way out, don't expect it to live. And then when they went back and surveyed the same tree in 2014, it's got new vigor, new growth, and looks like it's going to be a survivor.
Wow.
So a lot of times the trees can be set back, but not necessarily killed. So that is the indication that they have some natural resistance in the American tree. And so that's what we've developed our breeding program, is taking those trees and incorporating them in 2 surviving trees, bringing them together to produce offspring, and then we test the offspring. As I mentioned in the video, if there's 3 genes, the odds are out of every 200 trees you plant, 1 is going to show resistance. So out of my 2,000, I would get 10. And that's if it's 3 genes. If it's 4 genes, I might get no trees out of my 2,000. But we don't have, they've done work in the States on, of course, they have much deeper pockets than we do. They've mapped the genome, but they haven't identified which genes are responsible for resistance. And so that's where, and then of course in the States, they are doing genetic engineering on trees. People may be aware of the Syracuse tree, Darling 59, I think it's called, or 58, sorry, Darling 58, which is a genetically modified tree. It has a wheat gene put into its DNA. And what that wheat gene does is it destroys the oxalic acid. And as I mentioned earlier, the oxalic acid is what plugs the phloem and xylem cells and prevents communication within the tree. What they don't advertise is that the tree and the blight live together in this construed symbiotic relationship. So that blight can still be infecting other native trees. And the other thing is, any evolutionist would tell you, is that nature abhors a vacuum. So the blight will mutate to overcome that wheat gene, because that's in their nature, to evolve. And so what you could create is a superior or super virulent blight could come out of this genetically engineered tree. And that's one of the concerns that we have here in Canada. And therefore the Canadian Chestnut Council has lodged its official opposition to the EPA in the United States. And when it comes time, we'll lodge the same protest here in Canada. So right now, the indication is they're going to try to have the tree approved in Canada as an agricultural crop, not as a native tree.
Interesting.
And so that skirts the Endangered Species Act, but it would also mean the introduction. And the other big thing we're concerned about is that all the recent research has shown that our trees here in Canada are genetically unique to the American trees in the Appalachia and in the American Northeast. We have more commonality with trees in Georgia. Not that you could take a Georgia tree and grow it here, nor could you take a Canadian tree and try to grow it in Georgia, because of course, over time, they've evolved to be acclimatized specifically to their various climates. But that's another reason why we want to protect our tree, because it is unique to Canada. It's evolved here, and it's very distinct. At our last AGM, we had a very good presentation by Sophia. And of course, now Sophia's last name escapes me. Sorry, I should have this on the top of my head. But her research, and she's done a number of things. And so we wanted to defend our tree, and the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks is in agreement, as was the Ministry of Natural Resources, which originally had the stewardship, or originally had the endangered species included. So the idea was to save the Canadian tree and preserve it, and not bring outside stock into Canada. But that remains to be seen.
We have a question here, Ron, just on the same note. Is the blight a virus or a bacteria, or what is it?
It's a fungus.
Fungus.
It's a fungus that is evolved in mainland China or mainland Asia. And so the chestnut there has evolved with it, has developed its own resistance, and that's why we can use Chinese stock and breed it to gain resistance into other. Now, the virus aspect of that is in hypovirulence, and that's what saved the European chestnut, in that when the blight entered Europe and they start killing off, they found that there were viruses that would infect the fungus and give the fungus a flu and weaken it. And that let the tree have a chance for its immunization or its immunity system to kick in. And I mentioned the short growing season. Well, the same thing would be in Europe. In Northern Europe, you'd have that shorter growing season, and the fungus would continue its attack on the tree for a greater length of time. But by slowing the fungus down by the infection of the virus, the tree's immunity system has time to respond and communicate. And I guess if anyone's read Simard's book, she's from the forester from BC, that's what's the name of the book? Looking for the Mother Tree, and the relationship of forest and fungus and what's going on in the soil and the immune system of trees, and that trees communicate between each other. That's probably true of our American chestnut. So if blight attacks one tree, but the response may be slower than the blight. The blight might spread faster than the tree can respond to its neighbors and build up its immune thing. So here in North America, we've tried in a number of places down the States, here in Canada, hypovirulence. Nothing seems to have worked, but 30 years ago, we did it. The Chestnut Council did it here, and we kept track of it for about 5 years. Didn't seem to be much of a response. But in 2014, when we did our survey, 3 trees showed up to be demonstrating hypovirulence. So we're looking into it. But of course, dealing with viruses requires sophisticated lab, sterilization, and it takes deep pockets. So we haven't been able to go too far, and we're looking for researchers to take that on. And
I have
hopefully
a-
the council doesn't have to pay for the whole thing.
Yeah, no kidding. Neil, I want to turn it over to you briefly and just ask about the breaking isolation project and how you got involved in it and what it is, because there's some folks here that it said that they have some trees, and it would be good to know what that program is.
Sure. So unlike the blight, chestnut pollen does not travel very well. It's not really windborne very well. It kind of drops from the tree and goes out, I'm not sure, Ron, 100 feet or so. Anyway, it's not very far. And
Max.
chestnut trees that have survived tend to be isolated. So my tree is in the middle of 17 acres of a very large forest. I think there's another chestnut about 500 yards away. And in the other direction, another probably 1,000 yards away, there's a couple. There's no chance of my tree being pollinated. And when I heard about the breaking isolation project, I thought about it with my wife, and we decided that our tree it's really a museum specimen on its own in the forest. It's beautiful. We love it, but it's not able to help with the breeding program. So what the breaking isolation project is doing is taking some saplings. And so I've got 5 saplings planted around my chestnut. And the idea is that when they flower and the big tree flowers, the big tree will drop its pollen down. We'll get some crossbreeding, and then those nuts can enter the breeding program for research.
Okay, so anyone could just get in touch with Heather, for example, and say, look, I have a lonely, potentially a lonely American chestnut. Is there a way that I can get involved in this program? And then they would kind of work with you to plant the grafted trees. Is that how it works?
Probably email you, Ron.
Yes, that'd be fine. Or they could email. We keep a list of isolated trees. Actually, if they haven't been reported, the best one would be to Nathan Munn, who is with the Grand River, but he keeps our record of all newly reported trees. So if this is a tree that council's not aware of, or you think the council's not aware of, Nathan would be able to take the information, and then we can put it into our process to arrange a visit, see the suitability of the site. And there is a protocol that we have to follow for doing these projects and that, but yeah, that would be the thing. And then we can probably arrange it within a year or 2 years. We've got a bit of a backlog now because of COVID. So we've basically lost 2 years of doing outplantings other than for research. So, but we would be very interested in people's tree and doing that.
Okay, yeah.
61 is not.
I just wanted to add that there is a risk to it because you're introducing more chestnut trees into the proximity of your big tree. But we decided that it was worth it if we could improve the long-term chances of the tree surviving. And now it's, I guess it was just before the pandemic, so it must have been 2019, the fall, that ours were planted in. Everyone's doing fine so far, except
Okay,
I had to do a lot of gypsy moth picking on the little ones this year.
So you wouldn't say collect the seeds from the mother and then destroy the other ones or something like that. You would let them all try to grow up big and strong. You mentioned that they would kind of you're introducing some other trees, would that hinder the one that's there?
Well, the danger would be blight, accidentally bringing in blight. And
Okay,
so we try to monitor these sites, or the owner monitors it. And if there's any indication that a tree has an infection, we destroy that tree and then we'll replace it the following year.
okay,
But it is
Interesting.
the thing of, it's the initial planting in. And of course, most of these trees are on, the back 40, or I know a few of them where are back in the hills, especially in the Niagara Peninsula there. And so it's quite a hike in. So once you go in, plant your trees, we check them, and then we basically leave them alone so that we don't accidentally reintroduce. So after the initial planting and the checking to make sure that we haven't introduced any blight, then the sites are basically left to their own, and they may be checked. We encourage the owners to check them, and the odds of them accidentally introducing blight is much less than, say, our technician coming from one site to the next. So we try to keep the trees isolated from blight while breaking isolation.
We have quite a lot of questions around, where do I get these American chestnut trees? I got one from a nursery, someone wrote, and okay, so I've got them from a nursery. They said that they were American chestnuts. Should I register those? So what's the story around how do you get them? What should you be careful of when you're going to a nursery? And are you interested in knowing about those ones that people are planting from other nurseries?
Well, when the Endangered Species Act came into enforcement in 2008, a number of tree nurseries were grandfathered because they had their own private source of what's called sweet chestnut / American chestnut. They also have a number of hybrids. So when you're buying from a nursery, you have to, they'll be open pollinated. So you may be getting American, or you may be getting a hybrid. Because for us, for purity, we bag the flowers, we bag the burrs to ensure they're not doing that. They're open pollinated. So pollen in their orchard, their Chinese and their American may be growing side by side. And that, it's not a deliberate thing, it's just practicality. So, and if they're a reputable nursery in Ontario, if people just want 1 or 2 trees, that's the route I would suggest. One thing you need to be, some of the newer nurseries have imported stuff out of the States. There was locally here a couple of years ago, a small nursery that had started up, brought trees in from Minnesota. And I was contacted by a number of people, and I said not to buy them because, first off, they're from the States. They're claiming to be resistant which they were not. And you would provide contamination of the native trees. Okay, and of course, we now have evidence to show that Minnesota trees, which are planted trees outside the native range, even in the States, we don't have a clue where their pedigree is from. So that being said, the policy of the Chestnut Council has been, and this is being reinforced by our new stewardship agreement that we're working on with the ministry, is that trees should only be planted out in blocks of no less than 100 trees. So the ministry is basically telling us not to allow small plantings. That being said, in some circumstances, we can see, planting out 50 trees, like depending on the size of property. Biggest thing with planting out chestnut for us is soil. Chestnut loves sand. It will tolerate gravel. So in loam, and is a disaster in clay. So all our plantings are into sand and gravel. We've had no success in clay. We're just wasting all the effort in breeding and that in these outplantings into clay. So clay is a no-no. Sand is the thing. The other thing is pH. Chestnut prefers a pH of 5.5, which is low compared to any agricultural land. The tree originally grew in association with white pine and the oaks, particularly red oak, which are all acid producers. So even on my site, I dump sulfur on my ground to lower the pH initially to get the trees established. Again, that's on a larger scale, that's not practical. So soil pH will go as high as 6.5, but once you get closer to neutral, the trees will survive, but they will not thrive. So, and that is true in even some of the lighter clays. The tree will look the same 4 or 5 years after it's planted. Like you think, is this planted last year? No, it's 5 years old. They don't, the root system doesn't take.
Okay.
So those are the biggest things that we have to contend with. And I know we really appreciate people's enthusiasm and everything, but it's hard to say, well, you're sitting in the middle of clay in Lambton County. There's no way I can get a chestnut to grow there.
And to confirm, so you're not wanting, say someone has Chinese chestnut trees or, clearly a hybrid, you're not interested in registering those?
The registry is basically for pure trees.
Okay.
Now, there are hybrids. Now, we still do have a hybrid program where we're breeding resistance to get 98.5% American with that 1.5 with the Chinese resistance in it. That program, we're still doing that as well. So a hybrid that shows interest, our technician would be glad to come out and look at it, see it. I've gone with Dragon out and we've looked at hybrid trees, and he's taken cuttings or taken seed in that to incorporate it into our breeding program if there's something there that he sees. But generally, the registry is for known pure American chestnuts. Now, that's why the DNA testing verifies that, but even if your chestnut is partially foreign, it still might be able to be incorporated into the thing, but that doesn't go into the registry. We do that. Dragon does that sort of thing directly with the landowner, and he comes and gets materials or shares materials with them to help that tree along. Those are on a more case-by-case basis. It's not that we don't want people to ask. You can ask, and I will try my best to figure out a solution for it. But the tendency for the government now is that they want larger plantings to preserve the unique genome. But if there are trees that are isolated, like in the case of Neil's, those trees are very important. There's only a few clusters of wild native American chestnuts that are actually breeding. The last survey, out of the entire province, we only had 7 new recruits, which is about 0.3% reproduction rate. Mortality rate in the last, those 13 years was like 27%. So the tree is dying out faster than it can reproduce on its own. So breaking isolation is an attempt to increase the recruitment process and to counter that loss of trees. Because every time a tree dies, we lose those unique genetics. And that's why we've done a lot of this etiolated grafting. Locally here, there was a chestnut tree that was going over the embankment into Lake Erie. So we took as many cuttings off of it as we could. And out of all those cuttings, we got 27 grafted trees. The trees long gone into the lake, but those 27 grafts carry, the top portion carries the genome for that particular tree. So now we can try to preserve it and not narrow. We want to keep that big, broad genetic biodiversity. Because inbreeding, of course, becomes a problem. We only started with 26 families. If we'd had the knowledge we had now, we should have started with a minimum of 40 families. But that's, the progress in genetics and in breeding. So one of the things we've got to concern ourselves is that we don't inbreed the tree and make it sterile.
There's a question about growing. So say someone happens to find this on their property. What's it like to grow an American chestnut? Like say they wanted to just experiment for fun. Is it easy to grow? Are there transplant issues? What is it like to actually grow the seedling?
Well, the nut itself will germinate. The biggest thing is when you harvest the nut, stratify it right away. People tend to harvest the nuts, let them sit out somewhere and dry out for a couple weeks. That will reduce the germination. So what we do is we harvest the nuts, we harvest the burrs in the bags, and then the nuts are removed within a few days from the burr. They're sterilized. We dip them into a solution of hydrogen peroxide for about 20 seconds. And then we pull them out, and that kills any disease-causing things. One of the things we ran into one year is penicillin mold. We had 3,000 nuts, and out of those 3,000 nuts, we only had 12 nuts germinate because the penicillin had infected all the rest of the seeds. So the sterilization by peroxide, put them in a plastic bag with a paper towel, put them in the fridge, not the freezer, and leave them there for the winter. And then if you've got a greenhouse or you've got a sunny window, and I've done this in my place and I just use the sunny window, pull them out in February, put them into a soil mix that's got a lot of bark in it, specifically pine bark because you want a low pH. Put them in about a ½ inch below level and keep them moist, not drowned. The biggest thing with chestnut, it produces a taproot. So you want long, tall pots. So I've seen some schools, they use milk cartons. The pots that raspberries and the other cane berries come in from they're about 1 foot tall. Save those. They work very well. but you need that taproot. And they just need bright sun, and in about 2.5 weeks, you should see the lead come up. Now, the seed will germinate very quickly, but the chestnut puts a taproot down. So the first week and a half, you're not going to see anything above ground because it's sending a taproot. And if you leave your chestnuts in the fridge too long, you'll open the bag and all your seeds will have sprouted, and the taproots will be curled around each other in the bag because they're looking, it's time to germinate. So they've germinated, but they do need a stratification period. And then it's
Awesome.
just keeping lots of light and keeping them moist, and then waiting until the last frost has passed and planting them in the ground. The only thing I mentioned this in the video is if you have a drought, you got to water those puppies every week once they're in the ground. That taproot's got to get down into the water table. Once the root's in the water table, it will take care of itself. But getting a tree spends most of its first year getting that taproot down.
George Riken asks why he doesn't have a viable seed. Is that because there's not two of them? Perhaps, George?
Probably.
He says, we have 10.
Yeah.
No, he says we have 10 trees growing. I have not been able to find viable seed. Why is this?
Are the trees flowering yet?
Ron, here, I'll unmute you, George. Oh, you've got to unmute yourself. There you go.
That's it.
There we go.
You can hear me now. Yeah, they do flower. I got a couple of trees who flower, but I have other trees who don't. And so those ones, there's a couple of trees which produce nuts every year, but a lot of them are shriveled up nuts. They're not really fully formed. There's only a few fully formed.
If the nut is flat, it's not pollinated. So they're not pollinating properly.
Okay.
So possibility could be is that your trees are too closely related to each other. Did you buy them all from the same source at the same time?
I got them from the program back in the 1990s. They had a program with the Soil and Crop Improvement Association.
Oh, the Burford trees. Okay.
And I got 50 of them, and there's 10 of them growing yet. But now you were just talking about the pH. My pH is 7 plus. And this is maybe the reason why I lost so many.
But that pollination is probably incompatibility. And that could be that they are closely related to each other. Your 10
okay.
surviving trees are too closely related, and therefore they can't cross-pollinate it.
Okay.
But if you're getting burrs with flat nuts in them, that's just poor pollination. So the tree, your pH must be fine. The trees have probably got the roots deep enough that they're finding the acid that they require well below the topsoil. So it's probably a pollination problem. So compatibility would be Dr. Dragon Gallic would be the person to talk about what to do when you have incompatibility. But basically, you'd have to get trees from another source and that they provide a different source of pollen.
Okay.
But I can put you in contact with Dragon, and he can give you probably a much better scientific explanation and how to cure that or possibly fix that, George.
Well, yeah. So, well, it doesn't matter at this point anymore. I guess that yeah, that they're not viable. I wasn't going to culture them anyway. Nevertheless,
All you need is another pollen source. So that's something we could
yeah, that
to help
wouldn't be
you
too
out there.
difficult. Okay, so I might pick one up at a nursery someplace.
Yeah, try to find something. I've never heard of the Burford trees. We've tried to track down most of the Burford trees and that, and most of them are producing viable nuts. So it just might be the luck of, or the misfortune that you've got closely related trees.
And I didn't plant them in a block. I planted them in protected areas next to the woodlot and so forth. So there's trees sprinkled around here and there and all over the place. So that might be a problem too.
So, well, distance, yeah, if they're not in a block, are they more than 50 feet apart?
Yes, they are.
Well, that could be the pollen, as Neil said, the pollen base is fairly heavy and falls. There's some evidence that bees will carry it. Generally, they carry it back to the hives from the specific tree that they're harvesting. They don't tend to go from tree to tree.
Okay.
So you need, and see the loss of some of these insects that become extinct were probably pollinators between trees because it would have flown greater distances. So it's probably just a distant thing. You can collect pollen and sprinkle it on the female flowers, and
Okay.
that's how we get our nuts, our specific nuts. It's a little bit of work,
Sure.
but yeah, it's
George-
a distance problem.
George, I'll put you in touch. I'll put you in touch with Ron, and then maybe he can help you get maybe the appropriate
Well,
seedlings to go with
Yes.
those.
I certainly got a
Yeah.
clue now what the problem is.
Yeah,
I believe that's exactly what the problem is. Yeah.
yeah, because you've got quite a few over there. They're gorgeous.
Yeah.
And it would be a shame to lose them. So
I've got
let's-
some of them with about an 8 and 10-inch stem on them. So they're doing very well. They're about 40 feet tall.
Yeah, that's great.
I have another question here from Rose. How does the blight survive? Is there a natural, if there are only a few natural American chestnuts left, is there an alternate host?
Yeah, there's a whole, if you go on the ministry's website, they list off, I don't know, 10, 15. Sumac is supposed to be a host. Red oak is a host. Sassafras, for those that live on the north shore of Lake Erie, sassafras is a host. There's a lot of common stuff that is a host of the blight. So the blight is always with us. On my farm here, I had some planet chestnut. We put the plot in, was blight free. Then when we start doing our inoculation, then the blight escapes into the plot and that sort of thing. Now the plots on the front end of the farm, my other plots are in behind the woods on the far side. They've stayed blight free, even though they're that close, but there is an intervening woodlot. The blight comes, migratory birds will bring it north every year. It also moves in the wind, it moves in the rain. So any major storm pulls the blight spores up into the atmosphere and it moves with the weather systems. And that's why we've come to the realization that the blight is very easily spread, and there are no, years ago, the ministry had this idea that there were blight-free zones in Ontario, and it's completely incorrect. You can't stay blight-free. And that's why developing the resistance is key, and our outplantings are to try to preserve the genetics there by planting out as many trees. We have about 30,000 trees planted out now, and they represent, a large amount of that represents the genome from the 2,000 plus trees that are still in the wild. We try to make clones of all those trees to keep multiple copies in various locations as a reserve in case a mother tree does die. And that's
Okay.
part of the work too, is preserving the genome and trying to pass it into the future.
There's so many questions here. I want to try to get to some more of them. And
Yeah, let
in the
Neil
next
Ask
10
Neil a
minutes.
question.
And I know. Neil, maybe you know the answer to this. If we buy chestnuts from the grocery store, where are they coming from?
Well, in our grocery store, they're usually Italian. My area has a Loblaw store, and they're pretty well always Italian. So that would be a European chestnut.
Okay. So that's
You
probably
can
what
get
most people have eaten.
Spanish. Small local markets may be getting a local producer. Here locally, we have a grower in Sparta. There's one in down in Chatham. There's one in Boswell. They produce for the local markets, not necessarily for the chains.
Actually, I think Dolph Wynia sells his as well.
Yes, he does too. There are commercial growers that grow it for the production, for nut production.
Okay. And I think you might have answered this one already, but you need to wait till you see the leaves in the spring, correct? To do an audit. You can't do it any other time. It says we are new to our woodlot and have yet to conduct an audit. Do we have to wait to see the leaves in the spring? Are there other identifiers?
Identifying by leaf is probably the easiest thing. There are some unusual chestnut often looks like the bark is very similar to red oak, but there are some we've come across chestnut that have a very atypical bark. You would never think it was a chestnut. We've got one here close to Richmond that's like that. You would never identify it by its bark. We had to identify it by its leaf, and then we had it DNA tested, and it proved to be a pure American chestnut. But initially, we thought it was some sort of unusual hybrid. So there's genetic variation, but it's much easier unless the tree's producing burrs. If you come across, and I know turkey hunters often report chestnut to me, and they find them in the winter when they're traipsing through the woods, and they'll find a tree that's got burrs on the ground. And so burrs on the ground is definitely identifier.
Yeah.
But to walk through a wood, pick out the bark is pretty, even with an expert like our technician. I've spent some days searching a woodlot for a specific tree, and we spent 3 hours with a GPS before we found the tree, because they do blend in the winter.
Okay.
I found mine by the leaves on the ground. The leaves are so distinctive that they're really easy to spot.
There's a question, Ron, about your F2 trees. Those were all pure American, correct? You didn't, it says, are the F2
No,
trees?
my plot has pure American, and it does also have hybrid. And
Okay.
that's all kept in the records. Our technician has detailed, each tree is identified by the row and the tree number. So it would be row 2, tree 36. And that's why everything we do for seed production is in a bag. So we hand pollinate, put it in, seal it in a bag so that we don't get cross contamination, and that way we can select. So we've got two breeding. We've got the pure American chestnut breeding program, and we've also got the hybrid program going on at the same time.
Fantastic. And I think there's a few comments in here about where to look. So Neil's posted about the Trees in Canada book, page 20. Page 270. It shows the American, and 271 shows the Chinese. Robin Cunningham posted about the chestnut fact sheet, so that's there for you guys. I know that Neil had a photo here of the actual timber, so maybe you could just briefly explain this, Neil, what we're looking at. You're on mute. Sorry, Neil.
This is from a wood database that you can find online if you Google wood database and American chestnut. So this is a piece of dressed American chestnut. So it's planed and sanded and sealed, so that it gives you a sense of what you would see if you saw some trim in a house or a table or something, an old table that was made of chestnut.
Awesome.
And Ron tells me that chestnut was often used for coffins as well.
The cradle to
It was
grave.
called-
Well, that's very nice. It's a very nice looking wood. Yeah, and it gives people a reference, right? Because we don't often know when you're looking around if you're actually looking at one of these old American chestnuts. So it's nice for you to show that to everyone, so we have a bit of a reference of what the wood looks like. Okay, so there's a few questions about who people can contact. So I will send out the contact to everyone tomorrow when I share this recording. So have no fear. I'll make sure that you get in touch with everyone. I want to bring this to a close now, so that Ron can get a drink of water. Yes, Ron?
Once COVID is over, if anyone wants, if they're down in Elgin County, you're more than welcome to come and look at the plot. It's faces right on the road. So you can't miss it if you drive on Southdale. If you want to give me a call, I'll try to be home, but you're more than welcome to stop in. I know local people here just stop in and walk in to take a look every once in a while, and then they'll talk to me about it later. But everyone's welcome to come to this plot and look at it. And if you come in the fall and you happen to pick up a few nuts, I'm no wiser. Just don't take the ones that are in the bags. But, I just extend that invitation. And I'm open for people to come and see the plot at any time.
That's wonderful.
And thank you for hosting this.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. I'm sorry if I didn't get to everyone's questions. I tried my best to hit off all the categories that people were asking about, but surely there's going to be many more questions, and so I'll direct those to Ron and Neil and make sure everyone gets their questions answered. And as I said, there's over 50 people here, and everyone, I'm sure, really got A, their questions answered, and B, much more than that. And I just appreciate so much both of your time. And we've gone at half an hour over because there's so many questions, right? So thank you so much, and I'm sure this will lead to many more questions to come in the next couple of days. But yeah, between this time and the time that it took for you to record it as well, there's so much effort that's been put in, and we appreciate it so much. Neil, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I just want to give a shout out to Nathan Prey. He was the filmographer. He's a member of the Brant Association, and he doesn't even have a woodlot, but he loves trees so much, and he came and gave us his time to film it. So thank you, Nathan.
Yes, and he has a YouTube channel, and that is linked as well under the video on YouTube. So when you go to YouTube, you can see Nathan Prey's contact there. And yeah, he did an amazing job. It takes a lot of time and effort to put this together and to edit it all. So he did a wonderful, wonderful job. So thank you all so much for coming. We're getting lots of thank yous in the chat to both of you. So really appreciate it, and have a wonderful night. And I'll pass on this recording tomorrow in your email. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Okay,
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone.
Bye.
bye.
I'm gonna stay here for one more minute so everyone can get their contact, the contact information that people have listed in the chat. So copy it down if you haven't already. There's a great fact sheet posted here. So I'll just stay here for one more minute and then I'll sign off. Okay, have a wonderful night, everybody.